Campfire radio shows are heard in over 100 countries around the world. Our main programs are Author's Voice, Poetry Wheel, Storytales Radio Show, The Golden Ark of Treasure, The Charlie Checkers Show, Campfire Musicians, and On the Line Public Interest News. Every show is unique and provides interesting programs for our listeners. Join us each week at our Campfire on Tuesday at 12 o'clock noon on XRQK Los Angeles and Airtime America. To learn more about Storytellers Campfire, visit online at storytellers-campfire.org.
Welcome to Storytellers Campfire radio program. I'm Rich-Gehlhausen, hosting for today's Author's Voice segment with author Terry Irving. We'll discuss his new book, Warrior, the second novel in his freelancer book series. We're going to begin today's program with a dramatic reading from his new book, his new thriller, Warrior.
April 26, 1973. Wounded Knee, South Dakota. A .50 caliber machine gun bullet tore through the sky. Rick Putnam felt the hair on top of his head suddenly rise up from the pressure suction, and in a split second before he heard the thwop of the bullet, he'd already begun his dive to the ground. Fighting the pressure of the harness across his shoulders, he reached forward and grabbed the backpack of the woman in front of him and took her down with him. Both of them slammed hard into the dirt, driving the air from their lungs. Rick could feel her intake of breath, the prelude to a sharp complaint. He scrambled up the length of her body and slid a hand over her mouth before she could speak. "Stay quiet," he whispered urgently in her ear. "A round just went over. There could be more." After an instant, there was a soft kiss on his palm, and Eve Buffalo Calf remained silent. Rick Putnam raised his head slowly and scanned the South Dakota prairie that surrounded them. It was a quarter moon, and its wan light didn't even compete with the broad stripe of the Milky Way, as it illuminated the low hills and ravines. Someone standing still in the darkness or lying flat as they were was effectively invisible, but he knew that he would easily spot any headlights, flashlight beams, or most likely the red glow of lit cigarettes. He relaxed his grip on Eve. "I think we're okay," he said, his voice just above a whisper. Eve rolled onto her side as far as her backpack would allow and looked up at Rick. "What happened?" she asked softly. "Machine gun round," he said. "Big one. It had to have been less than a foot over my head. I could feel the bow shockwave in my hair. I reacted because where there's one, there are usually more." "Well, yeah, it would make sense that machine gun bullets would tend to travel in herds." In her voice was a gentle humor, but her eyes held a sense of urgency. Rick knew that she felt helpless, pinned by the massive aluminum carrier frame that curved at least 8 inches over her head, but there was no evidence of fear in her voice. It had been her decision to walk essential supplies into the American Indian Movement activists now blockaded in the tiny crossroads town of Wounded Knee. Now, with 50 pounds of flour, cornmeal, and dried milk pressing her into the dry dirt, she was as determined to continue as she'd been hours before when they'd started walking. Rick quietly popped the release buckle at his waist and slipped out of his own, much heavier pack. Once he'd struggled free, he lifted the massive rig of aluminum tubes and bungee cords off Eve so she could wriggle out, stand up, and stretch her sore muscles. As he stretched, he took another long look around, seeing nothing but dim outlines of dirt, rocks, and sparse prairie grasses until he looked east, the direction they were heading. There were faint streaks of red and slowly falling pinpoints of white on the horizon. Rick thought they might have even been beautiful if he hadn't known they were tracer rounds and parachute flares of the U.S. Marshals and other government forces as they continued to keep pressure on the radicals who had stood them off for months now. It didn't look like much of a standoff tonight, more like a pitched battle. In the cold silence of the prairie, Rick could make out a low mutter, the distant sound of hundreds, if not thousands, of rounds being fired. For a moment, he wondered why the sight of combat wasn't bringing back his own bitter memories of bullets zipping and buzzing through elephant grass under a blazing jungle sun. He loosened his rigid self-control for a moment and dared to hope that his constant visions of Vietnam were beginning to fade. Then he shook his head. He knew full well he wasn't that lucky. Most likely, it was simply that distance had reduced the intensity of combat into insignificant lights on the horizon. The nightmares would be back. "They're getting pounded in Wounded Knee tonight," he said. If they were getting hit by air cover, this could be a night attack in a Kong strongpoint. At that moment, he saw the lights of 2 fighter jets coming in low and fast over the tiny village, and he thought, the universe definitely has a sense of humor. They were outrunning the sound of their own engines, and so were heading straight for Rick and Eve in an eerie silence. "Jesus," muttered Eve. "Can they see us?" "Not at that speed," he said. "Anyway, I don't think they're looking for us." The jets went into a vertical climb, rolled over, and leveled out high over the small town. Now the scream of the phantom engines rolled across the flat plain. "They're just showing off." "That reminds me. Why was someone shooting at us a minute ago?" she asked. "I don't think they were," he answered. "The bullet wasn't going that fast when it went over me. It would have been a lot louder. That would mean it was just a stray from a long way away." He pulled the oversized aluminum frame with its load of desperately needed supplies back upright, crouched, and carefully began to arrange it across his broad shoulders. "It's funny. You think you're hidden out here in the dark, but a stray round can still find you. Bullets go a hell of a long way before they hit the ground." With a grunt, he stood and rebuckled the waist belt. Then he lifted the smaller pack that Eve carried. She stood patiently while he placed it on her shoulders as gently as he could. For a few moments he worked to adjust and settle the big pack into a position that was, if not comfortable, at least bearable. When he had finished, he kept patting and tweaking the aluminum frame with one hand, while he reached down and slid the other along the soft curve of her jeans. He could see the flash of her teeth in the darkness as she turned toward him smiling. "None of that, Trooper," she said. "We've still got a few miles to walk." "More than a few," he said. "We won't be anywhere near Wounded Knee until right before dawn." "Let's hope it's just a bit earlier." She turned and resumed a slow but steady walk toward the firefight. "It's really hard to make anything out in the false dawn. Things can just disappear." Rick knew she was referring to Larissa Ironcrow, the young Lakota woman, just a teenager really, who had prepared their pack of supplies and then walked with them under a beautiful sunset before sending them off on their night-long journey. She'd been softly singing the entire time. She said it was a song to give them the power to walk unseen. They would be like mist as they passed the state police, marshals, and tribal council goons who were trying to choke off Wounded Knee's fragile supply line. There was no doubt that they were walking into danger. Both the radicals of the American Indian movement and the supporters of the elected reservation leaders were capable of violence, but there were a lot more of the tribal council's quasi-official militia. They called themselves goons, which in a strictly tongue-in-cheek way stood for the guardians of the Oglala Nation. The cops and marshals might arrest you, but at least you'd end up in a jail cell. A dozen people who had started out on this long trek with packs of food had simply disappeared. The reservation was a big place to hide a body. "Maybe Larissa's song magic will work," he said, half joking. Eve's voice was totally serious. "It could. Lakota singers are powerful, and this is their land. The government has blockaded Wounded Knee for months, and food still gets in, and journalists keep getting their story out." "Maybe they have a Courier," he said wryly. "Missed the bike?" she asked over her shoulder. "Hell yeah. We'd have been there hours ago, and have front row seats for the fireworks if we were on a good dirt bike." He walked for a moment. "Of course the noise would have woken every cop from here to the Montana border, but there's a downside to every great idea." "You're right as usual, Trooper," she replied. "Just keep walking."
You've been listening to a reading from Terry Irving's new book, Warrior. We're going to talk with Terry in just a moment, but first we'll take a short commercial break, and we'll be right back.
Learning and good nutrition does not end when school lets out. The USDA's Summer Food Service Program helps provide nutritious meals to children in low-income areas so they're better fueled with healthy food to learn and grow. To learn more about sponsoring a feeding site in your community, go to www.summerfood.usda.gov.
Welcome back to Storytellers Campfire radio program in progress. I'm your host, Rich Gehlhausen, and with us today is author Terry Irving. Terry is a 4-time Emmy award-winning writer and producer. He's also won multiple Peabody Awards, DuPont Awards. He's been a producer, an editor, or writer with ABC, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. Hello, Terry. Welcome to Storytellers Campfire radio program.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It is really our pleasure, Terry. Yeah. Terry, you've written another, I think, great thriller, a historical novel, I guess we'd call it, Warrior. We need to talk about your new book.
I really find it objectionable, if not absolutely stunning, to find that when I write about my own life, it comes out as a historical thriller. I mean, it's really frightening. But yeah, 1972 and 1973 are the periods that I've written about so far. And, man, it was a different world. I didn't realize it until I wrote the books. But as bad as anyone thought it was in terms of the government spying on people and persecuting people and even killing people, or allegedly, it was probably worse. And as the facts have come out over the years, over the next 40 years, nobody back in 73 would have believed, really, I mean, you would have just been called paranoid, that the FBI and the federal government, the state governments were really doing what they were doing, which was infiltrating and trying to ruin people's lives, ruin people's names, ruin people's economic lives, make them lose their jobs just for objecting to the way the government was running. And it wasn't just the Indians, it was anyone involved in peace, it was the Black Panthers, it was the Hispanics, it was the environmentalists, it was anybody who was resistant or resisting the government's actions was fair game. And it made for, I was around, and I might have guessed at that, but I sort of knew that most of my conversations were probably recorded. I had no idea what was really going on. But it makes for a good subject for a thriller.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Wounded Knee in 1973. What was going on there? Well,
and here's the thing. I didn't write a history of Wounded Knee. And one of the reasons that I didn't write a history of Wounded Knee is that the histories are diametrically opposed. There is absolutely a history as written by the victors and a history as written by the vanquished. And they have no relationship to each other. They might have happened in different realities. So I picked the things that seemed to make sense to me and fit it in with a thriller. The story of young, mostly young,